Lady Isabella had nothing left. No food, no hope, just one last crust of bread. When a beggar knocked at her door, she gave it to him without hesitation. But the next morning, everything changed. The beggar returned not in rags, but in a royal carriage. And he wasn't just anyone. He was Prince Alexander of Ravenswood, heir to the throne. Why did he choose her? And what did it mean for both their futures? Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Last Crust. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers by the time Isabella Harrow placed the last crust of bread on the kitchen table. Christmas Eve, 1885. And the cupboards that had once overflowed with her father's finest loaves now stood empty, their bare shelves a silent testimony to everything they had lost. She ran her fingers along the worn wooden table, remembering when it had been dusted white with flour each morning, when the air had been thick with the yeast-sweet smell of rising dough, when her father's laughter had filled these rooms like warmth itself. Now the cottage felt hollow, the cold December wind finding every crack in the walls, whistling through spaces that no amount of newspaper stuffing could seal. Across from her, Thomas Harrow sat hunched over a broken chair, his calloused hands working a piece of twine through the splintered wood. He mended things now, chairs, hinges, anything neighbors brought him for a few pennies. He never baked. Not since the bakery had closed 6 months ago, when the debts had finally swallowed everything her mother's death had left behind. Isabella divided the bread with careful precision, pushing the larger half toward her father. The crust was hard, days old, but it was all they had until Thomas collected payment for his repair work tomorrow. "You've given me the lion's share again," Thomas said, without looking up from his mending, his voice quiet but firm. "I ate earlier," Isabella lied, the words coming easily now after months of practice. "While you were at the Hendersons." Her father's hands stilled on the twine. He looked up, and in the firelight she could see how thin he'd become, how the grief had carved hollows beneath his cheekbones. His eyes still sharp despite everything searched her face. "Bella, please, Papa." She forced brightness into her voice. "It's Christmas Eve. Let's not argue." He opened his mouth to protest, but Isabella had already turned away, busying herself with the kettle. She would make tea from leaves they'd already used twice before. If she added enough honey, the last spoonful in the jar, he might not notice how weak it was. The knock at the door came just as she was pouring the water. Both of them froze. Visitors were rare these days. Most of their old friends had drifted away when the bakery closed, embarrassed by their family's decline, or perhaps afraid that misfortune might be contagious. "I'll get it," Isabella said, setting down the kettle. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, and with it, snow that had begun falling in thick, silent curtains. A man stood on their doorstep, his form bent against the wind. His clothes were ragged, patched in places, mud-stained at the hems, but it was his face that caught her attention, middle-aged, with lines of hardship etched around his mouth, yet there was something in his bearing that seemed at odds with his appearance. He stood straight despite the cold, and when he spoke, his voice carried an unexpected refinement beneath its hoarse exhaustion. "Forgive the intrusion, miss," he said, his breath misting in the freezing air. "I wonder if you might spare a bit of bread. I've been walking since dawn, and He paused, seeming to struggle with the admission. "I have nothing." Isabella's stomach cramped with hunger, a sharp reminder of her own emptiness. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the door. Behind her, she heard her father rise from his chair. "Bella, we can't." But Isabella was already moving back toward the table. Her fingers closed around the bread, both pieces, her father's larger half and her own meager portion. It was all they had. Tomorrow they would have nothing. "We have each other," she said quietly, meeting her father's gaze. "He has no one." Something passed between them in that moment, some understanding that transcended words. Thomas's expression shifted from protest to resignation, then to something that might have been pride. He gave a small nod. Isabella returned to the door and wrapped the bread in a clean cloth, one of the few nice things they had left. The man's eyes widened as she pressed it into his hands. "Take it," she said. "Please." For a moment, the man simply stared at the bundle, his composure cracking. Surprise flickered across his features, followed by something deeper, genuine emotion, that he seemed unprepared for. His throat worked as he swallowed, and when he looked up at her, his eyes held an intensity that made Isabella's breath catch. "You give me your supper," he said slowly, as if testing the reality of it. "Your last meal." "It's Christmas Eve," Isabella replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "No one should be alone and hungry on Christmas Eve." The man studied her face with an attention that felt almost searching, as though he were trying to memorize every detail. Then, carefully, he mastered whatever emotion had threatened to overwhelm him. When he spoke again, his voice was steady but weighted with something Isabella couldn't quite identify. "True nobility needs no crown, miss." He clutched the bread to his chest. "May your kindness return to you tenfold." Before Isabella could respond, he turned and walked back into the snow. She watched him go, hugging herself against the cold that poured through the open doorway. There was something about the way he moved, a certain grace despite his ragged state, a confidence in his stride that seemed incongruous with his beggar's clothes. And his boots, even caked with mud, she could see they were well made, the leather quality far superior to what a vagabond should possess. "Strange fellow," Thomas murmured, coming to stand beside her. "Yes," Isabella agreed, though she couldn't articulate exactly what felt strange about him. It was as if he'd been playing a part, and for just a moment the mask had slipped. She closed the door and returned to the kitchen, where the table now stood completely bare. Her stomach ached, and exhaustion pulled at her bones. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and they would wake to an empty larder. But as she banked the fire and prepared for bed, Isabella found she had no regrets. The man's gratitude had been real, whatever else about him might have been false. And in that gratitude, she'd glimpsed something that felt more valuable than bread, a reminder that kindness still mattered, even when you had nothing left to give, perhaps especially then. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Ashford in white silence. Somewhere in that darkness, a beggar who wasn't quite what he seemed carried the last crust from a baker's daughter who had given everything without hesitation. And in the cottage on the edge of the village, Isabella Harrow lay awake, wondering why she couldn't stop thinking about the quality of a stranger's boots and the way he'd looked at her as if she'd given him something far more precious than bread. Chapter 2. The Royal Carriage. Isabella woke to her father, shaking her shoulder, his voice urgent and bewildered. "Bella, wake up. There's a royal carriage outside our door." She blinked against the pale Christmas morning light filtering through the thin curtains, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "A carriage," Thomas repeated, his face pale. "With the royal crest. People are gathering." Isabella threw off her threadbare blanket and rushed to the window. Her breath caught. There, impossibly out of place on their narrow, shabby street, stood a carriage that belonged in a painting. Gilded scrollwork gleamed even in the weak winter sun, and 4 matched black horses stamped their hooves against the cobblestones, their breath misting in the cold air. 2 footmen in crimson livery flanked the door, their posture rigid and formal, and the people half the village had already gathered, keeping a respectful distance, but craning their necks for a better view. Children pointed and whispered. Mrs. Weatherby from the boarding house clutched her shawl and spoke rapidly to anyone who would listen. The Henderson boys had climbed onto their garden wall for a better vantage point. "This must be a mistake," Isabella said, but her voice lacked conviction. Her mind was already racing back to the previous night, to the beggar's strange intensity, those incongruous boots. A knock thundered against their door, authoritative, commanding. Thomas looked at his daughter, fear and confusion warring in his expression. "Should I?" "I'll answer it," Isabella said, though her hands trembled as she pulled on her day dress, not bothering with more than basic propriety. Whatever this was, hiding would not make it disappear. She descended the narrow stairs, aware of her father close behind her. Through the warped glass of their front window, she could see the crowd had grown larger. This would be the talk of Ashford for months. Isabella opened the door. The man who stood before her wore a coat of midnight blue velvet, with gold braiding across the shoulders. A ceremonial sword hung at his hip, and medals she couldn't begin to identify gleamed on his chest. His dark hair was swept back from his face, revealing sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. He looked every inch the prince he was meant to be, but his eyes, those were the beggar's eyes, assessing, intense, uncomfortably perceptive. "You," Isabella breathed, and the word came out like an accusation. Prince Alexander inclined his head slightly, a gesture that managed to be both respectful and somehow amused. "Miss Harrow." The anger hit her then, sudden and white-hot. Not awe, Not the stammering deference he probably expected, but fury that burned away her shock. "You lied to me." A murmur rippled through the crowd behind him. The footman's eyes widened fractionally, but Alexander's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked pleased. "I did," he admitted simply. "You came to my door dressed in rags, pretending to be destitute, and her voice cracked. "We had nothing, nothing. And you made me, I made you nothing." Alexander interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "Every choice you made last night was yours alone. I simply allowed you to make it without the weight of my title influencing your decision. That's not—" Isabella struggled to find words adequate to her outrage. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed, "but it was honest. People show you who they really are when they think you're powerless, when they believe there's nothing to gain and nothing to fear from their actions." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "You showed me kindness, real kindness. Do you know how rare that is?" Behind Isabella, Thomas stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. "What do you want with my daughter, Your Highness?" Alexander's attention shifted to Thomas, and something in his expression softened. "Mr. Harrow, I mean no disrespect to you or to your daughter. I come to offer thanks, and to extend an invitation." "Thanks," Thomas repeated flatly. "You're a prince. You could have sent a servant with coins." "I could have." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "I've done exactly that for the past 10 years. Every Christmas Eve, I walk among my people in disguise. I've been offered stale bread I later learned was someone's only meal. I've been given coins from purses I knew were nearly empty. And every single time, every single person, they asked for something in return. A favor, a petition to be heard at court, employment for a son, clemency for a relative." His voice grew quieter. "In 10 years, your daughter is the first person who gave me something without expecting anything back, without even knowing there was anything to gain." Isabella's anger wavered, though she fought to hold on to it. "So this is a test? You go around testing people's charity?" "I go around trying to understand the kingdom I'll one day rule," Alexander corrected. "My father believes you govern from a throne room. I believe you can't lead people you don't understand." He gestured vaguely at the palace that lay somewhere beyond the village. "I was born into wealth I didn't earn, power I didn't ask for. Everyone I meet treats me like a prince first and a person second if they see the person at all. How am I supposed to know what my people truly need if no one will show me the truth?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Isabella found her anger draining away, replaced by something more complicated understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of it. "And now," she asked, "what happens now that you've found your honest person?" "Now I would like to thank you properly." Alexander reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope, the royal crest pressed into deep red wax. "And I would like to extend an invitation for you to visit Ravenswood Palace next week. Not for a ball or some grand social affair, simply to visit, to see how the other half lives, as they say." Isabella stared at the envelope as if it might bite her. "Why?" "Because you gave freely when you had nothing to give, because you saw a stranger in need and didn't hesitate." Alexander's voice carried a note of something that might have been longing. "I want to understand that. I want to understand how someone with so little could possess such generosity, while people with everything guard their wealth like dragons hoarding gold." He extended the envelope toward her. "Perhaps then you'll help me understand the divide I'm meant to bridge." Isabella didn't take it immediately. Her mind reeled with implications, with the impossibility of the moment. Behind her, she could hear her father's breathing, quick and anxious. Beyond Alexander, the crowd had grown silent, straining to hear every word. Mrs. Weatherby's voice suddenly cut through the quiet, shrill with scandal. "She's bewitched him. Mark my words, no good will come of this." Other voices rose in response, some defensive, some agreeing, some simply confused. Isabella saw Sarah Miller, a girl her own age, staring with undisguised envy. The butcher's wife crossed her arms and shook her head slowly. Old Mr. Tibbs removed his cap, looking genuinely pleased for her. "Your Highness," Thomas said carefully, his hand still on Isabella's shoulder, "my daughter is a good girl, an honest girl, but she's just a baker's daughter. What you're asking, I'm asking her to accept my gratitude and visit the palace for an afternoon," Alexander said. Nothing more, nothing less. But the weight of the unspoken hung heavy between them. They all knew this was more than a simple thank you. This was a prince, unmarried and of age, standing on a commoner's doorstep on Christmas morning, creating a spectacle that would echo through every drawing room and tavern in England. Isabella finally reached out and took the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, foreign to her work-roughened hands. "I'll consider your invitation, Your Highness," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Something that might have been disappointment flickered across Alexander's face had he expected immediate acceptance, but he masked it quickly with a formal smile. "That's all I ask, Miss Harrow," he bowed, a gesture far too respectful for someone of her station. "Merry Christmas to you and your father." He turned and walked back to his carriage, the crowd parting before him like water. The footman opened the door with synchronized precision, and within moments, the magnificent carriage was rolling away down the narrow street, leaving only wheel tracks in the light dusting of snow. The crowd didn't disperse. If anything, they pressed closer, questions erupting from every direction. Isabella retreated inside and closed the door, her heart hammering. Thomas stood in their small entryway, his face drawn with worry. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "This is dangerous, Bella," he finally said, his voice heavy with a fear Isabella had never heard before. "Princes don't marry bakers' daughters. They don't invite them to palaces for innocent visits. You'll be seen as—" He struggled for words. "The village already talks. You heard Mrs. Weatherby." Isabella looked down at the envelope in her hands, feeling its weight. The seal seemed to burn against her palm. "He said it was just a visit," she said quietly, "and perhaps he means that now." Thomas moved closer, cupping her face in his calloused hands. "But hearts are dangerous things, my darling girl. They don't respect stations or sense. Guard yours carefully, please." Isabella nodded, but even as she did, she knew it was already too late for simple caution. Something had begun last night when she'd given away her last crust of bread, something that a royal carriage and a sealed invitation had only confirmed. The question wasn't whether she would go to the palace. Looking into her father's worried eyes, Isabella knew she would. The question was what price she would pay for her curiosity. Outside, she could still hear the village buzzing with speculation, with scandal, with possibility, and in her hands, an invitation that felt like a door opening onto a world she'd never imagined entering and couldn't quite bring herself to refuse. Chapter 3. Two worlds collide. 1 week later, Isabella stood before the mirror in her small bedroom, adjusting the high collar of her mourning dress for the third time. It was her only good dress, the black silk she'd worn to her mother's funeral 2 years ago. The fabric had faded slightly to a charcoal grey in places, and she'd had to let out the seams herself, her stitching nowhere near as fine as her mother's had been. "You look lovely," Thomas said from the doorway, though his voice carried the same worry it had held since Christmas morning. Isabella turned to face him. "I look like I'm attending a funeral, not visiting a palace." "You look like yourself," he corrected gently. "That's more than enough." The carriage arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, not the grand gilded one from Christmas, but a smaller, more discreet vehicle that still managed to outshine everything on their street. Isabella kissed her father's cheek and stepped inside, feeling the curious eyes of neighbors tracking her every movement. The journey to Ravenswood Palace took 40 minutes, and with each passing mile, Isabella's anxiety grew. She'd never been beyond the boundaries of Ashford village. The countryside rolled past estates with manicured grounds, stone walls marking property she couldn't begin to imagine owning, bare winter trees standing like sentinels along the road. When the palace finally came into view, Isabella's breath caught. It wasn't just large, it was impossible. Towers reached toward the grey sky, windows glinted like 1,000 watching eyes, and the grounds stretched so far she couldn't see where they ended. The carriage stopped at a side entrance, not the grand front doors, she noticed. A small mercy, perhaps, or a subtle reminder of her place. A servant opened the carriage door and helped her down without meeting her eyes. Another waited to escort her inside, his face carefully blank. Isabella followed him through corridors that seemed to go on forever, her thin shoes clicking against marble floors so cold she could feel the chill seeping through her soles. She focused on small details to keep her anxiety at bay. The marble was veined with gold, real gold, probably. The portraits lining the walls all seemed to wear the same expression of vague disapproval, as though centuries of aristocrats were judging her audacity in walking these halls. Servants pressed themselves against the walls as she passed, averting their gazes as if looking at her directly might be contagious, might somehow taint them with her commonness. "Miss Harrow." Alexander's voice drew her attention to an open doorway. He stood framed by winter light from tall windows, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than her father's bakery had earned in a year. But it was his posture that struck her. Shoulders held rigid, chin slightly elevated, hands clasped formally behind his back. He looked like a prince, not like the man who'd stood on her doorstep in rags. "Your Highness," Isabella said, dropping into an awkward curtsy she'd practiced that morning. "Please, none of that." Alexander moved forward, his smile warm but somehow practiced, as though he'd learned exactly how to arrange his features for maximum charm. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't certain you would." "Neither was I," Isabella admitted. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or appreciation for her honesty. "Would you like a tour?" The tour was overwhelming. Room after room of impossible luxury, drawing rooms with silk wallpaper, ballrooms that could hold the entire population of Ashford, libraries with more books than Isabella had known existed. Alexander narrated it all with the practiced ease of someone who'd given this tour 100 times, pointing out historical details and architectural features. But Isabella noticed how his shoulders never quite relaxed, how his smile remained fixed, how he seemed to be performing the role of gracious host rather than simply being himself. "Are you always like this here?" she asked, interrupting his explanation of some painting's provenance. Alexander's practiced smile faltered. "Like what?" "Different," Isabella gestured vaguely. "Tighter, more careful." For a moment, he looked as though he might deflect the question with another charming smile. Then, something in his expression shifted, the mask cracking just slightly. "I'm surrounded by hundreds of people," he said quietly, his voice losing its formal polish. "Staff, courtiers, advisors, nobles seeking favor, but I've never felt more alone." The confession hung in the air between them. Isabella understood loneliness. She'd felt it keenly since her mother's death, in the empty cottage that had once been full of warmth and laughter. But she'd never imagined a prince in a palace could feel the same isolation. "Come with me," Alexander said suddenly, and this time when he walked, his stride was looser, more natural. "There's somewhere I want to show you." He led her through a maze of corridors, down a servant staircase, until they emerged into the palace kitchens. Heat and noise enveloped them immediately, pots clanging, ovens roaring, the head cook shouting orders to a dozen scurrying assistants. The cook, a robust woman with flour dusting her red cheeks, looked up in shock. "Your Highness, we weren't expecting." "I'm just showing Miss Harrow the kitchens, Mrs. Patterson. Don't mind us." But Isabella had already moved past him, drawn by the familiar scent of yeast and the sight of dough waiting to be shaped. Without thinking, she approached the work table where a young kitchen maid struggled with a stubborn mass of bread dough. "You're overworking it," Isabella said gently. "See how it's fighting you. It needs a softer touch." The maid glanced at Mrs. Patterson, who looked to Alexander, who simply nodded. Isabella rolled up her sleeves, propriety be damned, and demonstrated the technique her father had taught her years ago. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, coaxing the dough into submission with gentle pressure and patience. "There," she said, stepping back. "Let it rest now. Don't rush it." She looked up to find Alexander watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but his shoulders had finally relaxed, and the practiced smile had been replaced with something genuine. "You're different here too," he observed. Isabella glanced down at her flour-dusted hands. "This is where I belong. In kitchens, not drawing rooms. You looked more at home in the past 5 minutes than I've felt in 2 years of living here." Mrs. Patterson diplomatically ushered her staff to the far end of the kitchen, giving them the illusion of privacy. Alexander leaned against the work table, and for the first time since Isabella had arrived, he looked like the man who'd stood in the snow on Christmas Eve. "You didn't need to see how the poor live," Isabella said slowly, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "You needed to see how the rich do." Alexander's laugh was short and humorless. "Perhaps you're right. Why did you really invite me here?" He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the spilled flour on the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with an honesty that made Isabella's chest tighten. "My brother Edmund died 2 years ago. Hunting, accident. He was everything a crown prince should be, confident, commanding, born to lead." Alexander looked up, meeting her eyes. "I was the spare. I was meant to be free to travel, to study, to choose my own path. Edmund would be king, and I would be myself. And now? Now I'm neither the king my brother would have been, nor the man I wanted to become." His hands clenched into fists. "There are laws I must follow, expectations I must meet. My mother has already begun negotiations for my marriage to Lady Cecilia Ashworth. The engagement will be announced within months. Every aspect of my life is mapped out, decided by people who see me as a piece on a chessboard, not a person. Isabella understood then why he walked the streets in disguise, why he sought the truth in strangers' faces. He was drowning in a life he'd never chosen, suffocating under the weight of unwanted duty. "Then why invite me here?" she asked, though the question came out softer than she'd intended. "To show me what I can never be part of. To remind yourself of the freedom you've lost." Alexander's gaze held hers, and in his eyes she saw the same intensity that had stopped her breath on Christmas Eve. "Because when I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be real." The words settled over her like snow, cold and beautiful and terrifying. This was dangerous. Her father had warned her, and he'd been right. Hearts didn't respect stations or sense. "Your Highness." "Alexander," he interrupted. "When we're alone, please. Just Alexander." "Alexander," she repeated, the name feeling both intimate and forbidden. "You're engaged. To be engaged to a woman you've never mentioned feeling anything for. You're a prince with duties and expectations. I'm a baker's daughter who lives in a cottage with holes in the walls. This," she gestured between them, "whatever this is, it can't go anywhere." "I know." The admission seemed to pain him. "Believe me, I know. But I also know that I haven't felt this alive, this much like myself, since before Edmund died. Is it so wrong to want to hold on to that feeling, even if just for a little while?" Isabella should have said yes, should have thanked him for the tour, returned to her carriage, and never looked back. Should have protected her heart, the way her father had begged her to. Instead, she heard herself say, "Then don't invite me back to the palace." Alexander's face fell. "Meet me in the village," she continued. "In Ashford, where you can wear your disguise, and I can be myself, where we can both breathe." Hope flickered across his features. "You'd want to see me again?" "I think we both know I shouldn't." Isabella pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how the kitchen's warmth had faded. "But I also think we both know I will." Alexander moved closer, close enough that she could see the golden flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to catch the scent of bergamot and something else, sadness perhaps, or longing. "Next week," he said quietly. "The Rose and Crown Tavern, 7 o'clock. I'll be the shabby stranger in the corner, and I'll be the foolish girl who should know better." His smile was small and sad and genuine. "Then we'll be perfectly matched." The carriage ride home felt shorter than the journey there. Isabella watched the palace disappear behind her, her mind replaying every moment, every word, every dangerous promise they'd made. When she arrived home, Thomas took one look at her face and sighed. "You're going to see him again," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Bella." "I know, Papa." Isabella removed her shawl and hung it carefully on its hook. "I know it's foolish. I know it can't lead anywhere. I know all the reasons I should walk away. And yet you won't. And yet I won't." Thomas pulled her into an embrace, his chin resting on top of her head the way he had when she was small. "Then I suppose all I can do is be here to catch you when you fall." Isabella closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of wood shavings and old pipe tobacco that clung to her father's clothes. She knew she was standing on the edge of something that would either destroy her or transform her. But in the palace kitchens, with flour on her hands and Alexander watching her as if she were something precious, she'd felt more alive than she had in 2 years. And that feeling, however dangerous, however impossible, was something she couldn't bring herself to let go. Not yet. Chapter 4. The Arrangement. Ravenswood Palace. The formal dining room glittered with enough candlelight to illuminate a small village. Alexander sat at the head of the impossibly long table, his mother to his right, and Lady Cecilia Ashworth to his left. It was their 5th meeting, all carefully orchestrated, all painfully formal. Cecilia was everything a future princess should be. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid hours to perfect. Her gown was the palest blue silk, cut to emphasize her figure while maintaining perfect propriety. She spoke French fluently, played the pianoforte beautifully, and could discuss literature, art, and politics with equal grace. She was also deeply, obviously miserable. "The pheasant is excellent," Cecilia said, her voice carrying the practiced pleasantness of someone who'd been trained since childhood to fill silences with meaningless conversation. "Your chef has outdone himself, Your Majesty." Queen Margareta smiled, though Alexander noticed the tightness around her eyes. His mother had been different since Edmund's death, harder, more desperate to secure the succession. She saw Cecilia not as a person but as a solution to a problem. "We're so pleased you could join us again, Lady Cecilia," the Queen said. "I trust your father is well?" "Quite well, thank you." Cecilia's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her fork. "He sends his regards and hopes the negotiations are proceeding smoothly." Negotiations. As if they were discussing a trade agreement rather than a marriage. The door to the dining room opened, and Alexander's cousin entered without announcement. Lord Edmund Blackwood, named after Alexander's dead brother, in what Alexander had always suspected was a calculated move by his ambitious uncle, strode in as though he owned the palace already. "Apologies for my lateness," Blackwood said, though his tone suggested he felt no such thing. He was handsome in a sharp-edged way, his dark hair slicked back, his clothes impeccably tailored. "I was dealing with a household matter. Nothing serious, I hope," the Queen said, though her voice had cooled noticeably. A servant broke a vase. 17th century, irreplaceable. Blackwood took his seat across from Alexander with casual grace. "I dismissed her immediately. Of course, can't have clumsy help damaging our heritage." "Our heritage?" Alexander repeated quietly. Blackwood's smile was all teeth. "The family heritage, cousin. We must all do our part to maintain standards. Speaking of which," he turned his attention to Cecilia. "Lady Ashworth, how lovely you look this evening. Cousin Alexander is a fortunate man." Cecilia's expression remained perfectly pleasant, but Alexander saw the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the way her eyes went flat and distant. She'd recognized the predatory quality in Blackwood's tone, the way he assessed her like property that might soon be his to claim. "Thank you, Lord Blackwood," she said coolly. The dinner dragged on with agonizing slowness. Blackwood dominated the conversation, offering opinions on everything from Parliament's latest session to the unfortunate decline in proper breeding among the lower classes. Each comment seemed designed to needle Alexander, to remind everyone at the table that his claim to the throne was tentative at best. "Of course, once we clean out the weak bloodlines," Blackwood said, swirling his wine, "England will be strong again. My father has several proposals for reforming the succession laws, making them more rigorous." The threat was barely veiled. Alexander's hands clenched beneath the table. When dinner finally ended, Cecilia caught Alexander's eye and gave a minute nod toward the portrait gallery. He understood immediately she wanted to speak privately. They found a quiet alcove, far enough from the dining room that they wouldn't be overheard. Cecilia's perfect composure cracked the moment they were alone. "I can't do this," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I can't spend another dinner pretending that man isn't everything wrong with aristocracy. Blackwood is a monster," Cecilia finished. "And if you don't marry me soon, he'll challenge your succession. We both know it." Alexander studied her face, seeing for the first time the intelligence and frustration beneath the practiced pleasantness. "You don't want this marriage any more than I do." "Of course I don't," Cecilia laughed bitterly. "But neither of us wants this arrangement. We both understand duty, don't we? My father's estate is drowning in debt. This marriage is his last hope to save our family from ruin. And you," she paused, "you need a proper wife to secure your claim, or Blackwood will tear apart everything you hope to build. There has to be another way." "Is there?" Cecilia's gaze was sharp. "Because from where I stand, we're both prisoners, just in different cages." Before Alexander could respond, a servant appeared, informing them that the Queen required Alexander's presence in her private study immediately. His mother stood by the window when he entered, her posture rigid. She didn't turn to face him. "You will announce your engagement to Lady Cecilia at the winter ball in 3 weeks, she said, her voice brooking no argument. "Mother, Edmund will contest your claim to succession if you don't." Now she turned, and Alexander saw real fear in her eyes. "The law is clear, Alexander. Your brother's death made you heir, but without producing an heir yourself through proper marriage, your cousin can challenge. His father has already begun gathering support among the nobles. Then we change the law." "There isn't time." The Queen's composure cracked. "Don't you understand? I've already lost one son. I cannot—" her voice broke. "I cannot lose another. Marry Cecilia, secure your position, do your duty." Alexander stood alone in the study long after his mother left, staring at the same shelves of law books his brother had once studied. Edmund had known every statute, every precedent. He'd been born to rule. Alexander pulled down a volume on succession law and began to read. If there was a loophole, a way to secure his claim without marrying Cecilia, he would find it, even if it took all night. Ashford Village. Isabella discovered the true cost of a prince's attention when she went to market 3 days after her palace visit. Mrs. Cooper, who'd sold her father bread flour for 15 years, refused to serve her. "I'm sorry, Miss Harrow," the woman said, though her eyes were cold, "but I can't be seen doing business with someone who's, well, you understand." "No," Isabella said carefully. "I don't understand." "Mrs." Cooper leaned closer, lowering her voice. "People are talking, dear, saying you've gotten ideas above your station, that you're trying to bewitch the prince. It's unseemly." Heat flooded Isabella's cheeks. "I was invited to the palace. I didn't force my way in." "Nevertheless," Mrs. Cooper straightened, "I have my reputation to consider. Good day." It was the same everywhere. The butcher claimed he was out of the cheap cuts she could afford, though she could see them clearly on his counter. The church ladies who'd once offered her their condolences about her mother now crossed the street to avoid her. Even children pointed and whispered as she passed. By the time Isabella returned home, her basket was nearly empty and her eyes burned with unshed tears. Thomas found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. "They're saying things, Bella," he said quietly, sitting beside her. "Cruel things. Perhaps you should stop seeing him." "I've done nothing wrong," Isabella said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't apologize for kindness." "I know, my darling, but kindness has a price, it seems, especially when it crosses certain lines." A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas answered it, and Isabella heard unfamiliar voices, rough, deliberately intimidating. Her father returned with 2 men who wore fine enough clothes but carried themselves like thugs. One of them smiled at Isabella in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Harrow," the smiling man said, "we've come with a message from Lord Edmund Blackwood." Isabella stood slowly. "I don't know any Lord Blackwood." "Oh, but he knows you. The prince's cousin, you see. Very interested in his cousin's associations." The man stepped closer. "Lord Blackwood wants you to know that common girls who reach above their station tend to fall very hard. Accidents happen. Reputations are destroyed. Families find themselves with even less than they started with." Thomas moved between Isabella and the men. "Get out of my house." "Just delivering a message, old man." The smiling man tipped his hat mockingly. "Think carefully about your choices, Miss Harrow. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again." They left, and Thomas immediately bolted the door. His hands were shaking. "Bella, this has gone too far. These aren't idle threats. If this Blackwood is threatened by you, by whatever he thinks you represent to the prince, I'll write to Alexander," Isabella said, though fear made her voice unsteady. "Tell him I can't see him again." But even as she said it, she knew she couldn't. Whatever had begun between them, this connection that made her feel alive for the first time since her mother's death, she wasn't ready to surrender it. Not to Mrs. Cooper's disapproval, not to church ladies' whispers, not even to Blackwood's threats. She was terrified. But she was also done apologizing for caring about someone who saw her as a person rather than a problem. That night, Alexander stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the moon hanging full and silver over the palace grounds. Somewhere beyond those walls, beyond the manicured gardens and guarded gates, Isabella was looking at the same moon. He'd spent hours in the law library and found nothing, no loophole, no precedent that would allow him to refuse the marriage without giving Blackwood grounds to challenge. The law was clear: produce an heir through legitimate marriage or risk everything. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he saw Isabella's hands working dough in the palace kitchen. He heard her voice. "You didn't need to see how the poor live. You needed to see how the rich do." She understood him in a way no one else did, saw through the title to the person trapped beneath it. 3 weeks until the winter ball. 3 weeks until his engagement to Cecilia would be announced. 3 weeks to find a way to change laws that had stood for centuries, or to accept that duty would always triumph over desire. In her small bedroom, Isabella stood at her own window, watching the same moon. The threats echoed in her mind, mixing with the memory of shopkeepers' cold refusals and neighbors' whispers. She should walk away. She should protect her father, protect herself, accept that princes and bakers' daughters lived in different worlds for good reason. But then she remembered Alexander's words. "When I'm with you, I remember what it feels like to be real." She understood that feeling. With him, she felt seen not as a poor girl to be pitied or a scandal to be whispered about, but as someone whose opinions mattered, whose kindness had value beyond her station. Tomorrow she would face more rejection, more cruelty, more consequences for daring to cross invisible lines. But tonight, staring at the moon, Isabella made a choice. She wouldn't apologize. She wouldn't hide. She wouldn't let fear dictate her life any more than Alexander would let duty erase his soul. Whatever came next, scandal, threat, heartbreak, she would face it standing upright. Two people, two windows, one moon, both trapped by circumstances neither had chosen, both refusing, in their own ways, to surrender without a fight. Chapter 5. The Bread Lesson. The knock came just after 9 o'clock, soft and careful, nothing like the authoritative pounding that had accompanied the prince's official visits. Isabella knew who it was before she opened the door. Alexander stood on her doorstep in his beggar's clothes, the same ragged coat and worn boots he'd used on Christmas Eve, though she noticed he'd added authentic mud stains this time, as if he'd actually walked through the countryside rather than arriving by carriage. "You're getting better at the disguise," Isabella said, stepping aside to let him in. "Practice." He pulled off his cap as he entered, and his hair fell forward, making him look younger, less like a prince. "Is your father?" "Asleep upstairs. He retires early these days." Isabella closed the door and led him to the kitchen, where a ball of dough sat rising beneath a damp cloth. The fire in the hearth had warmed the small space, and the lingering scent of yeast filled the air. Alexander's eyes went to the dough immediately. "You're baking. Papa asked for bread tomorrow. Real bread, not the stale crusts we've been making do with." Isabella moved to the table and uncovered the dough, pressing her fingers into it to test its readiness. "Mr. Henderson finally paid him for those chair repairs so we could afford flour again." "Teach me," Alexander said suddenly. Isabella looked up, surprised. "What?" "Teach me to make bread." He moved closer to the table, his voice earnest. "I want to make something with my own hands, something real. Not sign papers or attend meetings or perform duties. Just create something." Isabella studied his face, seeing the desperation beneath the request. How long had it been since he'd made anything? How much of his life was spent in ceremony and obligation, never actually doing anything of substance? "All right," she said quietly, "but you have to follow my instructions exactly. Bread doesn't care if you're a prince." A smile flickered across his face, the first genuine smile she'd seen since he'd arrived. "I suspect that's why I want to learn." Isabella retrieved another ball of dough she'd prepared earlier and set it on the floured table. "First, you knead. It's all about rhythm and patience," she demonstrated, pressing the heels of her hands into the dough, folding it over, turning it, pressing again. The motion was as natural to her as breathing, learned at her mother's side when she was barely tall enough to reach the table. Alexander attempted to copy her movements, but his hands were uncertain, his pressure too aggressive one moment, too tentative the next. "Here," Isabella moved to stand beside him, her hands covering his. "Feel the rhythm. Push, fold, turn. Don't fight it. Work with it." His hands stilled beneath hers, and she felt his sharp intake of breath. They stood like that for a moment, her rough baker's hands guiding his smooth aristocratic ones through the dough. She was acutely aware of his warmth beside her, the scent of bergamot that clung to him despite the ragged clothes. "Like this?" he asked, his voice lower than before. "Yes, just like that." Isabella stepped back, letting him work alone. "You can't rush bread. It needs time, patience, the right conditions to rise. Force it, and you'll only make it tough." Alexander's hands moved through the dough with growing confidence. "Is that a metaphor?" "Everything in baking is a metaphor if you look hard enough." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the soft thump of dough against wood. Isabella found herself watching his hands, strong and capable despite their inexperience, learning the rhythm with surprising speed. "Edmund knew how to lead," Alexander said suddenly, his voice quiet. "He was born knowing, somehow. Could walk into a room and people would defer to him naturally. He never questioned whether he deserved the crown. He just was." "And you?" Isabella prompted gently. "I only know how to question." His hands stilled on the dough. "Every decision, every tradition, every law, I see the flaws in all of it, the ways it hurts people, the ways it fails them. Edmund would have been a strong king. I'll just be one who doubts everything." Isabella moved to stand across from him, meeting his eyes over the table. "Maybe a king who questions is exactly what the kingdom needs." Alexander looked at her as if she'd offered him something precious. You really believe that? Edmund is gone, Isabella said carefully. But you're here, and from what I've seen, you care about the people you'll rule. That matters more than certainty. Does it? Alexander resumed kneading, but his movements were heavier now. When I'm forced to marry a woman I don't love to satisfy political arrangements? When I have to smile and perform and be what everyone expects instead of what I am? Isabella thought of her own loss, the way grief had hollowed out her father. When Mama died, Papa stopped baking. It was like he died too, but kept breathing. He goes through the motions, mending things, existing, but there's no joy in it anymore. No purpose beyond simple survival. I'm sorry, Alexander said, and she could hear that he meant it. I tell you this because I understand what it means to lose yourself, to become someone you don't recognize, because circumstance demanded it. Isabella shaped her own dough into a round loaf with practiced efficiency. But Papa's grief is honest, at least. Yours would be a choice forced upon me. Still a choice. They set the loaves aside to rise one final time, and Isabella gestured to the chairs by the fire. As they sat, she noticed the ink stains on Alexander's fingers, dark smudges that no amount of washing had quite removed. You've been writing, she observed. Alexander looked down at his hands as if he'd forgotten about the stains. Then, slowly, he nodded. I've been documenting things. Every unjust law, every policy that hurts the poor while protecting the wealthy, preparing reforms. Reforms? Isabella leaned forward, interested despite herself. If I must be king, I'll be one worth serving. There was fierce determination in his voice now. I can't change the fact that I was born into privilege, but I can change what that privilege means. Laws about tenant farmers' rights, debt reform, education access. I've been studying it all, writing proposals. Isabella felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. That's why you walk among your people in disguise. You're not just observing, you're learning, gathering evidence. Exactly. But then his expression darkened. Though it won't matter if I'm forced to marry Cecilia. Her family will control my policies. They need this marriage to save their estate from bankruptcy, and they'll fight any reform that threatens aristocratic wealth. Then fight for your throne, Isabella said, her voice stronger than she felt. Truly fight for it. Find a way to secure your claim without sacrificing everything you want to accomplish. There is no way. I've spent hours in the law library searching for loopholes, and... He broke off, frustrated. The law is absolute. Produce an heir through legitimate marriage or face challenge from Blackwood. The timer Isabella had set chimed softly. The bread was ready. She moved to the oven and carefully removed both loaves, setting them on the table. They were perfect, golden brown and fragrant, steam rising from their crusts. Still warm, Isabella said, breaking off a piece from one loaf. The best way to eat bread. She held the piece out to Alexander, and he took it from her fingers, their hands brushing. He broke it in half and handed one piece back to her. To honest bread, he said, and honest hearts. They ate, and the bread tasted like hope, warm and simple and real. Alexander closed his eyes, savoring it. We made this, he said wonderingly. Together, we did. When he opened his eyes, they were very close. Isabella wasn't sure who moved first, perhaps they both did, but suddenly his hand was cupping her cheek, and her fingers were tangled in his shirt, and their lips met in a kiss that tasted of butter and warmth and desperate, impossible longing. It was sweet and soft and spontaneous, nothing like the calculated formality of court life. It was real. It was them. And it was interrupted by the creak of stairs. They broke apart to find Thomas standing in the doorway, still in his nightshirt, his face pale in the firelight. He'd heard everything, the confessions, the plans, the kiss. Papa, Isabella began, but Thomas held up a hand. Your Highness, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. I think you should leave. Alexander stood, his posture defensive. Mr. Harrow, I can explain. You can't. Thomas moved into the kitchen, and Isabella saw the fear in his eyes, not anger, but deep, bone-aching fear. You're a prince who will be king. My daughter is a baker's daughter. This, he gestured between them, this cannot end well. I care for her, Alexander said. I know you do. I can see it. Thomas's voice softened. But if you truly love her, Your Highness, you'll let her go before they destroy her to get to you. The words hung in the air like a curse. Isabella wanted to protest, to insist that she could handle whatever came, but she saw the truth in her father's eyes. He'd already received threats, already seen how the village turned on her, and Blackwood's men had made their position clear. Alexander looked at Isabella, his expression torn. "I can protect her." "Can you?" Thomas asked quietly. "You can't even protect yourself from an arranged marriage. How will you protect my daughter from the entire weight of aristocracy determined to keep her in her place?" The question had no good answer, and they all knew it. Alexander moved toward the back door, his hand lingering on the frame. He looked back at Isabella one last time, and she saw her own anguish reflected in his face. "I won't give up," he said. "I'll find a way." Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. Isabella stood holding the bread they'd made together, still warm in her hands. Her lips still tingled from their kiss. Her heart still raced with the impossible hope that love might be enough. But her father's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time she understood the full weight of what loving Alexander meant. It wasn't just about class differences or social disapproval. It was about power, the kind that could destroy lives with a word, that could turn kindness into scandal and love into a weapon. She broke off a piece of the bread and ate it slowly, tasting Alexander in every bite, and understood, finally, that love might not be enough. But she couldn't bring herself to let go. Not yet. Chapter 6. The Winter Ball. The invitation arrived 3 days before the Winter Ball, delivered by a palace messenger who refused to meet Isabella's eyes. The envelope was unmarked, no royal seal, no formal announcement. Just her name in handwriting she recognized from the notes Alexander had begun leaving with the bread deliveries he'd secretly arranged for her father. Inside, a single line. "Please come. I need you there. A." Thomas found her staring at it, her hands trembling. "You can't go," he said immediately. "Bella, after everything that's happened, the threats, the village turning on us, you can't walk into that palace and give them more ammunition. He asked me to come, and you'll be destroyed for it." Thomas moved closer, desperation creeping into his voice. "They'll tear you apart, my darling. These people, they don't forgive commoners who dare to reach above their station." Isabella folded the invitation carefully, her decision already made. "Then they'll tear me apart, but I will not hide. If Alexander fights for his throne, I can face one ballroom." The next day, Thomas disappeared for several hours. When he returned, he carried a package wrapped in brown paper, his face drawn with worry. "I borrowed from the Bakers' Guild," he said quietly, setting the package on the kitchen table. "It's not much, but—" Inside was a gown, simple compared to what the aristocracy would wear, but elegant in its restraint. Deep blue silk that reminded Isabella of the night sky, with modest sleeves and a neckline that wouldn't scandalize. No elaborate embroidery, no jeweled accents, just honest craftsmanship. "Papa," Isabella whispered, her throat tight. "You shouldn't have. Let me do this." Thomas cupped her face in his calloused hands. "If you're determined to walk into the lion's den, at least walk in with your head high." The night of the Winter Ball, Isabella stood before the palace entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. Carriages rolled past, gilded, magnificent, carrying passengers dripping with jewels and privilege. She'd arrived on foot, unable to afford even a hired carriage, her simple cloak doing little to ward off the December cold. When she entered the ballroom, every head turned. The whispers started immediately, cascading through the crowd like dominoes falling. Isabella felt hundreds of eyes assessing her simple gown, her lack of jewels, the unmistakable mark of poverty that no amount of borrowed silk could hide. That's her, the baker's daughter, the one who's bewitched the prince. How dare she show her face here? Isabella's instinct was to run, to turn, and flee back to the safety of her cottage. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked toward the edge of the ballroom, staying near the walls where she could observe without being completely exposed. She would not appear intimidated. She would not give them that satisfaction. The ballroom was magnificent, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across marble floors, gold leaf adorning every surface, windows overlooking snow-covered gardens. Musicians played from a raised platform, and servants circulated with champagne that probably cost more than her father's cottage. Isabella accepted a glass from a passing servant, more for something to hold than any desire to drink. "You came." Isabella turned to find Lady Cecilia Ashworth standing beside her, resplendent in a gown of silver that must have cost a small fortune. Her golden hair was arranged in an elaborate style, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears. She looked every inch the future princess. But her eyes held something unexpected, not hostility, but curiosity. "Lady Ashworth," Isabella said carefully, "walk with me." It wasn't a request. Cecilia moved toward a small alcove partially hidden by marble columns, and Isabella followed, bewildered. Once they were alone, Cecilia turned to face her directly. "You love him," Isabella's breath caught. "I don't deny it. I saw your face when you entered. You were looking for him." Cecilia's expression was unreadable. "Does it matter?" "Does it?" Isabella countered, finding her footing. "You're going to marry him, tonight presumably. Your engagement will be announced." "Yes." Cecilia looked away, her jaw tight. "Because I don't have a choice. My family's fortune is failing, has been for years. My father made terrible investments, and now we're drowning in debt. This marriage is his last hope to save us from complete ruin." Isabella hadn't expected this honesty, this vulnerability from someone she'd thought of as simply another obstacle. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "Are you?" Cecilia's smile was bitter. "You should be celebrating. I'm the woman standing between you and the man you love, but you don't love him." "No," Cecilia met her eyes, "and I suspect he doesn't love me. We've had exactly 7 conversations, all painfully formal. I know nothing about him except that he's duty-bound and miserable and desperately searching for something he can't find in palaces and ballrooms." "Then why?" "Because duty is all some of us have." Cecilia's voice hardened. "You think you're trapped by poverty? I'm trapped by expectations, by family obligations, by the weight of a name that demands I sacrifice everything for propriety. Perhaps we're both prisoners, just in different cages." Before Isabella could respond, a commotion near the ballroom entrance drew their attention. The crowd parted, and Lord Edmund Blackwood strode through, his presence commanding immediate attention. He moved to the center of the ballroom, and the musicians fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, "I apologize for the interruption, but there's a matter that requires immediate attention." Queen Margareta appeared on the balcony above, her face pale. "Edmund, this is neither the time nor—" "It's exactly the time, Your Majesty." Blackwood's smile was all teeth. "I'm filing a formal challenge to Prince Alexander's succession to the throne." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Isabella's hand tightened on her champagne glass. "On what grounds?" someone called out. "On grounds that he is unfit to rule," Blackwood gestured broadly. "He consorts with commoners." His gaze found Isabella, and his smile widened. "He neglects his duties, refuses proper marriage arrangements, and demonstrates repeatedly that he lacks the judgment necessary to lead this kingdom." The ballroom erupted in whispers. Some nobles nodded in agreement, others looked uncomfortable, uncertain. The crowd was dividing before Isabella's eyes, political factions forming in real time. "This is absurd," one elderly duke protested. "Prince Alexander is—" "Is what?" Blackwood interrupted. "A man who abandons royal protocol to play dress-up in the streets, who invites bakers' daughters to the palace, who refuses the marriage alliance that would secure our kingdom's future." Isabella felt every eye turn toward her. The weight of their judgment was crushing. She'd become a weapon, a piece of evidence in Blackwood's case against Alexander. Then the ballroom doors opened again, and Alexander entered. He looked different. Gone was the uncertain, questioning Prince Isabella had come to know. His bearing was commanding, his expression resolved and dangerous. He moved through the crowd with deadly purpose, heading straight for the center of the ballroom where Blackwood waited. "You question my fitness to rule," Alexander said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "Let me be clear about my priorities." He turned, his gaze sweeping across the assembled nobility until it found Isabella. Then he walked directly to her, the crowd parting before him, and extended his hand. "This woman," Alexander said, speaking not to Isabella but to everyone watching, gave her last meal to a stranger on Christmas Eve. She asked nothing in return. She showed kindness when she had every reason to withhold it. That is the nobility this kingdom needs. Isabella placed her hand in his, her heart racing. This was no longer about romance. This was a public declaration, a line drawn in marble and gold. Alexander turned back to Blackwood, still holding Isabella's hand. "You want to challenge my succession? Do it legally. File your petitions, gather your supporters, present your case to Parliament. But know this, I will fight you with every law, every precedent, every ounce of will I possess. I will not be bullied into abandoning my principles." The music began again, someone's attempt to restore normalcy, and Alexander led Isabella to the center of the ballroom. They began to dance, and it was no longer romantic. It was defiant. A public declaration that he would not be ashamed of her, would not hide their connection to satisfy political expedience. But as they moved across the floor, Isabella saw the consequences of his courage. Several nobles were walking out, their expressions scandalized. Others clustered in groups, whispering furiously. The Duke of Hampshire publicly removed his support. 3 influential families followed. Queen Margaretta's face was unreadable from her position on the balcony, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the railing. "You're losing supporters," Isabella whispered. "I know." Alexander's hand tightened on hers. "But I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not. This is my fault. I shouldn't have come." "Don't," his voice was fierce. "Don't apologize for existing. Don't apologize for being the only real thing in this entire palace." But Isabella could see the truth clearly now. She wasn't just in love with a prince. She'd become a political liability that could cost him everything: his throne, his ability to enact the reforms he'd spent months preparing, his entire future. The dance ended, and chaos erupted. Nobles argued openly, some defending Alexander, others calling for his removal from succession. Blackwood stood in the center of it all, looking triumphant. Lady Cecilia appeared at Isabella's elbow. "You should leave," she said quietly. "Now, before this gets worse." "It can't get worse. It can always get worse." Cecilia's expression was sad. "Welcome to royal politics, Miss Harrow, where love is a liability and kindness is a weapon used against you." Isabella looked at Alexander, surrounded by arguing nobles, his face set in determined lines as he defended his position. She'd wanted to support him. Instead, she'd given his enemies exactly what they needed to destroy him. And in that moment, Isabella understood what her father had tried to tell her from the beginning. Love might not be enough. Sometimes, it might be the very thing that destroys you both. Chapter 7. The Sacrifice. Isabella fled the ballroom the moment the dancing stopped, her borrowed gown rustling as she pushed through the crowd of arguing nobles. The air inside had become suffocating: too many voices, too many judgmental eyes, too much consequence for a single act of kindness on Christmas Eve. She found herself in the palace gardens, where snow-covered topiaries cast long shadows under the moonlight. Her breath misted in the cold air, but she barely felt it. Her mind was still reeling from Blackwood's challenge, from the nobles walking out, from the way Alexander had held her hand in front of everyone, as if daring the world to judge them. "Isabella." She turned to find Alexander striding toward her, still in his formal attire, his expression desperate. He'd followed her out, abandoning the chaos inside. "You shouldn't be out here," she said. "They need you inside. Your mother, your supporters. Let them wait." Alexander reached for her hands, his grip almost painful in its intensity. "Come away with me." Isabella stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What?" "Run away with me. Tonight. Now." His words tumbled out in a rush. "We'll leave everything behind: the throne, the politics, all of it. We'll go somewhere they can't find us." "Alexander, you're not thinking clearly." "I've never thought more clearly in my life." He pulled her closer, his eyes blazing with something between determination and desperation. "I'll abdicate. Give Blackwood what he wants. We'll go to France, Italy, anywhere. I'm not the prince. Anywhere we can just be ourselves." For a moment, Isabella let herself imagine it. A small cottage in the French countryside. Alexander teaching village children to read while she baked bread for their neighbors. No titles, no expectations, no weight of crowns and kingdoms. Just them, building a simple life with their own hands. The fantasy was so vivid, she could almost taste it: warm bread and morning coffee, and the freedom to love without consequence. But then reality crashed back. "And what happens to your kingdom?" she asked quietly. Alexander's grip on her hands loosened slightly. "What? Your kingdom? The people you've been documenting injustices for, preparing reforms for?" Isabella's voice grew stronger. "What happens to them when Blackwood becomes king? He won't. Someone else will challenge him. Will they?" Isabella pulled her hands free, pacing away from him. "Or will everyone be too afraid of his cruelty to stand against him? You've told me about his illegal land seizures, his abuse of servants. Is that the man you want ruling England?" "What kingdom?" Alexander's voice broke with anguish. "Blackwood will destroy everything I've worked for anyway. Half the nobility walked out tonight. They already support him." I've lost before the fight even begins. Then fight him. Isabella whirled to face him, her borrowed gown swirling around her ankles. Here, now, with the laws you've been studying, the evidence you've been gathering, fight for the throne you're meant to have. You're asking me to choose between you and the throne. No. Isabella moved closer, her voice softening even as her resolve hardened. I'm asking you to choose the kind of king you want to be, the one who runs when things get difficult, or the one who stands and fights for what's right, even when it costs him everything? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but a voice from the shadows interrupted. He chooses to fight. They both spun to find Queen Margareta emerging from behind a marble statue, her formal gown glinting in the moonlight, and behind her, looking equally determined, was Lady Cecilia. You were listening, Alexander said, his voice flat with shock. I've been listening to you suffocate under duty for 2 years, the Queen replied, her voice carrying an emotion Isabella had never heard from her before, raw, maternal fear. I will not watch you die the same death your brother did, trapped in a life you never chose. Your Majesty, Isabella began, but Margareta held up a hand. Miss Harrow is right. You must fight. But not alone. The Queen looked at Cecilia. Lady Ashworth has a proposal. Cecilia stepped forward, her silver gown catching the light. She looked nothing like the perfect, compliant aristocrat Isabella had imagined. Her expression was fierce, determined. I'm withdrawing from our engagement, Cecilia announced. Publicly, I'll cite incompatibility, which saves face for both our families, while making it clear the decision is mine. Alexander stared at her. Cecilia, your father. My father needs this marriage alliance to save our estate from bankruptcy. Cecilia's voice was steady, though Isabella saw her hands trembling slightly. But I need my freedom more than his approval. I'm tired of being a bargaining chip. Your family will be ruined, Alexander said quietly. Not if you intervene. Cecilia met his gaze directly. Use your royal authority to forgive my family's debts. It's within your power as heir apparent. In exchange, I give you your freedom. That's, Alexander struggled for words, that's an extraordinary request, and you're in an extraordinary situation. Cecilia's smile was sad. Besides, I suspect if you become king, you'll implement debt reforms anyway. My family will simply be the first beneficiaries. The Queen moved closer to her son. I've been conducting my own investigation into Blackwood's activities, illegal land seizures from tenant farmers, embezzlement of family funds. Documented abuse of servants 3 have disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Isabella felt cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. We have evidence, Margareta continued. Letters, testimony from witnesses I've been protecting, enough to destroy his challenge completely, but it will require public hearings, scandal, time. How much time? Isabella asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. The Queen turned to her, and Isabella saw something like respect in her eyes. 3 months to gather all the evidence and prepare the case. Perhaps 6 before it goes before Parliament and Blackwood's challenge is formally dismissed. 6 months, Isabella repeated numbly. During which time, the Queen continued, her voice gentling, you and Alexander cannot be seen together. If you're seen as a couple while this unfolds, Blackwood's supporters will use it as proof that Alexander is unfit, that he prioritizes personal desire over duty, that he's being influenced by inappropriate sources. No, Alexander's voice was sharp. I won't ask her to hide. I won't treat her like something shameful. You're not asking, Isabella interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. I'm choosing. Fight your battle, Alexander. Win your throne. Then come for me, Isabella. But, she continued, meeting his eyes, when you do come for me, I come as I am. No etiquette training. No transformation into someone more suitable for court. If I'm not acceptable to your world now, I never will be. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, anguish, mixing with understanding. I don't want you to change. Then promise me you'll change the court instead, Isabella said. Make it a place where kindness matters more than breeding, where a baker's daughter can stand beside a king without the kingdom falling apart. I promise. Alexander's voice was rough with emotion. I swear it. Cecilia cleared her throat softly. Then we have an agreement. I'll make my announcement tomorrow. Your Majesty will begin the formal investigation into Blackwood's corruption, and she looked at Isabella with something like sympathy. Miss Harrow will return to her village until the proceedings are complete. The Queen nodded. I'll ensure your father faces no further threats. Anyone who touches you or your family will answer to me personally." It was decided, then. Isabella should have felt relief, a plan, a path forward, protection for her father. Instead, she felt only the crushing weight of impending loss. "Can we have a moment?" Alexander asked quietly. "Alone?" The Queen and Cecilia withdrew discreetly, disappearing back into the palace. Alexander and Isabella stood in the snow-covered garden, two people in borrowed time. 6 months, Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or forever, if you lose." "I won't lose." But his hands shook as he reached for her. "I can't lose. Not now. Not when I've finally found." He didn't finish. Instead, he pulled her into a kiss that tasted of desperation and goodbye, and promises neither of them could guarantee. Isabella's hands tangled in his hair, holding him close, trying to memorize everything the way he held her, the sound of his breathing, the warmth of him against the cold night. When they finally broke apart, both their faces were wet with tears. Neither had realized they were crying. "This isn't an ending," Alexander said, though his voice wavered. "It's not." "Then it's a pause." Isabella stepped back, putting necessary distance between them. "Fight well, Your Highness. Fight for the kingdom you want to build. Fight to be worthy of the crown." "I'll fight to be worthy of you." Isabella shook her head. "You already are. Now prove it to everyone else." She turned and walked toward the palace gates before her resolve could crumble. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the snow pink and gold. Behind her, she heard Alexander's voice, rough and broken. "Isabella." She paused but didn't turn back. If she looked at him now, she'd never leave. "I love you," he said. "Whatever happens, however long it takes, I love you." "I know," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if he could hear. "I love you too." Then she walked through the palace gates and kept walking, through the awakening city streets, through the outskirts where grand estates gave way to modest houses, all the way back to Ashford Village and her father's cottage. From his window in the East Tower, Alexander watched her go. The sun rose fully as she disappeared from view, and he stood there long after, one hand pressed against the cold glass. Behind him, his mother entered quietly. "She's stronger than I expected," Margareta said. "She's stronger than anyone expected." Alexander's voice was hollow. "Myself included. You know this is necessary." "I know, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. If I lose, if Blackwood wins, then she'll have lost nothing but time wasted on an unworthy cause." Margareta moved to stand beside her son. "But you won't lose. We won't let you." Alexander finally turned from the window. His eyes were red, his formal attire rumpled from the long night, but his expression was resolute. "Then let's begin," he said. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'm fighting for my throne." And somewhere in the distance, walking the familiar roads home, Isabella Harrow made the same vow. She'd wait, she'd endure, she'd prove to everyone that a baker's daughter could possess the strength and dignity of any princess. And if Alexander lost his fight, if 6 months stretched into forever, at least she'd know she'd faced it all standing upright. No apologies, no hiding, no regrets. Just the quiet strength of a woman who'd given her last crust of bread to a stranger, and in doing so, had changed both their lives forever. Chapter 8. The Legal Battle. 2 months later, Parliament, London. Alexander stood before the assembled Lords and Commons, his hands gripping the edge of the Speaker's podium. 2 months of relentless investigation, sleepless nights, and political maneuvering had led to this moment. The parliamentary chamber was packed, every seat filled, spectators crowding the galleries above. Lord Edmund Blackwood sat in the front row, his expression one of practiced boredom, as if this entire proceeding were beneath his notice. "Exhibit 17, Alexander announced, his voice carrying through the hushed chamber. "Land seizure documents from Blackwood's estate in Yorkshire. 43 tenant farmers forcibly removed from land they'd worked for generations. No compensation, no legal recourse." He held up the papers, official documents bearing Blackwood's seal, obtained by his mother's network of loyal servants who'd risked everything to provide evidence. "Lies," Blackwood called out lazily. "Those farmers were removed for non-payment of rent, perfectly legal." "Perhaps your lordship can explain," Alexander continued, "why the rent records show payments made in full, yet the eviction notices claim default. Or why 3 of those farmers have since disappeared under mysterious circumstances." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Alexander pressed his advantage. Exhibit 18. Financial records showing embezzlement of family trust funds, money meant for estate improvements diverted to personal accounts. Exhibit 19. Testimony from servants regarding physical abuse and threats. He paused, meeting Blackwood's eyes directly. Shall I continue? I have 47 more exhibits documenting corruption, cruelty, and criminal behavior. Blackwood's boredom had transformed into barely concealed fury. This is a witch hunt, a desperate attempt by an unfit heir to— On the matter of fitness, Alexander interrupted, his voice cold. Let's address the legal foundation of your challenge. You claim I'm unfit because I refuse to marry Lady Cecilia Ashworth, correct? Among other failings, yes. Alexander allowed himself a thin smile. Then, I direct the Chamber's attention to the Act of Settlement, 1701, specifically the provision that abolished forced marriage as a requirement for royal succession. The law states clearly the monarch must marry with consent of Parliament, but cannot be compelled to marry a specific individual. He let that sink in. Several lawyers in the audience were already nodding. My mother's ultimatum that I marry Lady Ashworth or face challenge was, legally speaking, meaningless. You have no grounds to question my succession based on my choice of bride. The chamber erupted. Blackwood shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking. You're twisting the law. I'm using the law, Alexander corrected, as any competent ruler should, which brings me to my proposal for reform. He laid out his planned succession based on competence rather than proximity of bloodline, expanded rights for tenant farmers, debt reform, protections against the kind of abuse Blackwood had perpetrated. Each proposal was backed by legal precedent, carefully researched during months of late-night study. By the time he finished, half the chamber was applauding. The other half sat in stony silence. Later that evening, Alexander sat alone in his study, surrounded by law books and evidence files. He hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night in weeks. His formal clothes hung loose, he'd lost weight, forgot to eat unless someone reminded him. His face in the mirror that morning had looked haggard, harder than he remembered. A knock at the door. Lady Cecilia entered without waiting for permission, as had become her habit. They'd formed an unlikely friendship over the past 2 months, two people trapped by circumstance, fighting for freedom in different ways. You look terrible, Cecilia said bluntly, settling into the chair across from his desk. Thank you for that assessment. I'm serious, Alexander. She leaned forward, her expression concerned. You're killing yourself for this fight. What choice do I have? Alexander's voice was rough with exhaustion. If I stop now, you won't stop. I know that. Cecilia picked up one of his reform proposals, scanning it. But I also know that look in your eyes. You're considering surrender. Alexander didn't deny it. The thought had crossed his mind more than once recently. Give up the fight. Marry Cecilia as originally planned. Let Blackwood's challenge die quietly. It would be easier. Don't you dare, Cecilia said quietly. Don't you dare quit now. I didn't sacrifice my father's approval for nothing. I didn't stand up in front of the entire aristocracy and announce I wouldn't be sold like livestock just so you could give up when things get difficult. People are suffering because of this fight. Blackwood spreading rumors, bribing witnesses, destroying anyone who supports me. And if you surrender, he wins. He becomes king eventually. And every tenant farmer, every servant, every person without power will suffer far worse than they do now. Cecilia stood, moving to the window. You asked me once why I agreed to help you. It's because I saw something in you that Edmund never had doubt. You question everything, including yourself. Edmund would have been a strong king, but you'll be a just one, and that matters more. The next day, Queen Margareta did something unprecedented. She appeared before Parliament and testified publicly about Blackwood's cruelty, breaking every rule of royal protocol to do so. I have watched Lord Blackwood terrorize servants, she stated clearly, her voice unwavering. I have documented his illegal activities, and I will not stand by silently while he destroys everything my son Edmund died protecting. The chamber fell silent. A queen testifying against a peer of the realm was unheard of. My eldest son knew how to command, Margareta continued, but my surviving son knows how to care. England needs both qualities in a king. We need someone who questions whether power is being used justly, not someone who wields it carelessly. Ashford Village. Isabella rose before dawn, as she had every day for 2 months. The Bakers' Guild had offered her father a loan to reopen the bakery, and she'd thrown herself into the work with single-minded determination. By the time the sun rose, she'd already prepared 36 loaves, the familiar rhythm of kneading and shaping, providing a meditation that kept darker thoughts at bay. "You're hiding in work the way I did," Thomas observed, watching her from the doorway. Isabella's hands stilled in the dough. "I'm rebuilding. There's a difference." "Is there?" Her father moved closer. "You work from before dawn until after dark. You've barely spoken about him in weeks. That's not rebuilding, Bella. That's burying." That night, alone in the bakery after her father had gone to bed, Isabella finally let herself cry. She sat on the flour-dusted floor and wept for Alexander, fighting his battle alone, for the future they might never have, for the girl she'd been on Christmas Eve, who'd thought kindness was simple. But then, through her tears, she noticed something. The children's baking lesson she'd planned for tomorrow, ingredients laid out, recipes written in simple language so even the poorest children could learn. She'd started the lessons 3 weeks ago, teaching neighborhood children the skills her mother had taught her. Not because it would change the aristocracy's world, but because it changed hers. "If I cannot change the nobility's world," she whispered to the empty bakery, "I can change my own." The next morning, she gathered the children, 8 of them, ranging from 6 to 12, all from families barely scraping by. "Bread rises because of what's inside it," she told them, as they worked dough with small, eager hands. "Not because of what others think it should be. You understand?" Young Timothy, the blacksmith's son, looked up with flour on his nose. "Like us, Miss Isabella, we rise because of what's in our hearts, not because of who our parents are." Isabella's throat tightened with emotion. "Exactly like that." The threat came the following week. One of Blackwood's men appeared at the bakery, his smile cold and calculated. "Lord Blackwood suggests," the man said, "that you might want to publicly denounce the prince. Say you were deceived, taken advantage of. It would be safer for you and your father." Isabella set down the bread she'd been preparing and looked the man directly in the eyes. "Tell Lord Blackwood I have nothing to denounce. Miss Harrow, I don't think you understand the danger." "I understand perfectly." Isabella's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "Now get out of my bakery." After he left, she sat down and wrote a letter. Not a private note, but an open letter to the Ashford Gazette. She wrote about Alexander's character, his genuine desire to understand his people, his commitment to justice, his courage in fighting corruption. "I am nobody of consequence," she concluded, "but I have seen this prince's heart, and it is worthy of a crown. Let those who judge him remember, true nobility is measured not by birth, but by the choices we make when no one is watching." The letter was published 3 days later. By the end of the week, it had been reprinted in the London Times, the Manchester Guardian, and a dozen other papers across England. Common people began writing their own letters, sharing stories of Alexander's reforms, his fairness, his genuine concern for those without power. Public opinion began to shift, like a tide turning. Parliament, 6 weeks later. Alexander stood in the chamber for the final hearing, exhaustion weighing on him like iron chains. But beside him stood allies, his mother, Lady Cecilia, 36 lords who'd been swayed by evidence, and the testimony of countless commoners who'd travelled to London to support him. The verdict came down unanimously. Blackwood's challenge was dismissed. The evidence of corruption was undeniable. He was stripped of his titles, his lands forfeit, criminal charges pending. Alexander had won. But as he stood in the empty throne room that evening, the victory felt hollow. He'd made enemies of powerful families. The kingdom was divided. Reforms would take years to implement, and resistance would be fierce. He pulled Isabella's letter from his pocket. He'd been carrying it since the day it was published, the paper soft from repeated readings. "I have seen this prince's heart, and it is worthy of a crown." She'd defended him when she had everything to lose. She'd stood up to Blackwood's threats. She'd changed public opinion not by transforming herself to fit their world, but by remaining so authentically herself that people couldn't help but listen. Alexander looked at the empty throne, the seat he'd won the right to occupy someday. Then he looked at Isabella's letter. He'd fought for his throne. He'd proven himself worthy of the crown. Now came the harder question. Would he have the courage to claim the woman he loved, knowing it would reignite every controversy, every argument, every division his victory had temporarily settled? Or would he consolidate power, marry appropriately, and let Isabella remain a beautiful memory of what might have been? The throne room offered no answers. Only the weight of choices still to come. Chapter 9. A New Kingdom. Early March. 1886. Spring was just beginning to touch Ashford village when the royal carriage appeared on the main street. No disguise this time, no attempt at secrecy. The gilded crest gleamed in the morning sunlight, and 4 matched horses stood at attention while the entire village gathered to watch. Isabella was in the bakery when she heard the commotion. She'd risen before dawn, as usual, and her hands were covered in flour, her simple work dress dusted white. Through the window, she saw the crowd forming, heard the whispers building like a wave. She knew, even before she stepped outside, that Alexander had come. He stood beside the carriage in full formal attire, looking every inch the prince he was. But when he saw her flour-covered, work-worn, completely herself, his expression softened into something tender and real. "Miss Harrow," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Then quieter, "Isabella." She walked toward him, aware of every eye watching, every neighbor who'd shunned her now pressing close to witness this moment. Thomas appeared at her side, protective as always, but she touched his arm gently. "It's all right, Papa." Alexander moved to meet her in the middle of the muddy street, and Isabella realized he was nervous. His hands weren't quite steady, and there was vulnerability in his eyes that belied his formal bearing. "I will not ask you to become something you're not," he began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "I will not promise you an easy life at court. There will be opposition, cruelty, politics that would test the patience of a saint." Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. "But I am asking you to stand beside me, not behind me, not in my shadow, beside me." He took her flour-covered hands in his. "Help me build a kingdom where birth doesn't determine worth, where compassion matters more than title, where a baker's daughter can change the world simply by being exactly who she is." Then, to the shock of everyone watching, Alexander knelt in the muddy street. His expensive clothes touched the dirt, but he didn't seem to notice or care. "Isabella Harrow," he said, looking up at her with his whole heart in his eyes, "will you marry me?" The crowd held its collective breath. Isabella looked down at this prince kneeling before her, at the man who'd walked away from everything safe and certain because he believed in something better. But she didn't answer immediately. "Will you expect me to stop baking?" she asked. A smile tugged at Alexander's lips. "I expect you to teach others to bake. I expect you to fill the palace kitchens with the same warmth you brought to your father's cottage. Will I have to pretend to be someone I'm not? Learn to curtsy perfectly and speak in careful phrases and become a porcelain doll for the court to admire? I hope you never pretend anything." Alexander's voice was fierce now. "I hope you attend parliament sessions and argue with advisors and remind everyone daily that their opinions aren't as important as they think they are." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. "Will you use our marriage to consolidate power or to change things?" "Both." Alexander stood, still holding her hands. "Is that honest enough? I'll use every advantage I have, including marrying the woman who changed public opinion with a single letter, to push through reforms. But I'll also wake up every morning grateful that you chose me." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. Then, "On one condition." "Anything. The first thing we do is forgive Lady Cecilia's family debts, as you promised her." Alexander's smile was brilliant. "Already done. The papers were signed yesterday." "Then yes," Isabella said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." The crowd erupted. Some cheered the blacksmith, young Timothy, the families whose children Isabella had taught to bake. Others looked scandalized, faces frozen in disapproval. Most were simply shocked, unable to process what they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Weatherby fainted dramatically. The butcher's wife crossed herself and muttered about the world turning upside down. But Isabella only saw Alexander, and the way he kissed her there in the muddy street, in front of everyone, claiming her publicly as he'd promised to do. The wedding, 3 weeks later. They married at the cathedral in London, not the grand state affair some expected, but a ceremony that bridged both worlds. The doors were open to public attendance, and common people filled the pews alongside nobility. Bakers stood near barons. Tenant farmers sat behind earls. Isabella wore a gown she'd helped sew herself, elegant in its simplicity, deep blue silk that reminded her of the night sky. No jewels dripping from her throat, no elaborate train requiring 6 attendants, just honest craftsmanship and clean lines. Thomas walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his weathered face, and Isabella gripped his arm tightly, drawing strength from the man who'd taught her that kindness mattered more than station. Lady Cecilia attended as a guest, sitting near the front in a gown of pale green. She caught Isabella's eye and smiled genuine happiness for this unconventional princess who'd helped free them both. Queen Margareta stood to give her blessing, her voice carrying through the packed cathedral. Let this union remind us that a kingdom is only as strong as the character of those who lead it. May we all learn from their courage. Notable families were absent: the Duke of Hampshire, the Earls of 3 counties, a dozen other nobles who couldn't stomach this breach of propriety. Empty pews stood as testament to opposition that hadn't died with Blackwood's defeat. The ceremony proceeded with traditional vows, but when it came time for Alexander's promises, he added something unscripted. "I promise," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "to never forget where I found you and who you were when you gave away your last piece of bread. That woman, generous, brave, completely herself, is who I choose, today and always." Isabella's tears fell freely then, and she didn't bother to hide them. 6 months later, Princess Isabella stood in the palace kitchens, her hands deep in bread dough, while the head cook directed operations around her. It was Wednesday, her baking day, a tradition she'd established immediately upon becoming princess. Once a week, she worked alongside the kitchen staff, and the bread they made together was distributed to the poor. Some courtiers found it scandalous. Isabella found it necessary. "Your Highness," Mrs. Patterson said, using the title Isabella still wasn't accustomed to hearing, "the Parliament session begins in an hour." "I know." Isabella shaped the dough into loaves with practiced efficiency. "I'll be there." Her attendance at Parliament sessions had caused its own scandal. Women weren't forbidden from attending. Exactly, but centuries of precedent suggested they shouldn't. Isabella attended anyway, sitting in the gallery, occasionally standing to speak when debates touched on education reform or poverty relief. She'd made enemies doing it, powerful ones. The death threat started 3 months into her marriage, anonymous letters promising violence if she didn't know her place. 2 actual assassination attempts, 1 poisoned tea, 1 knife attack that Alexander's guards had intercepted. But the threats only hardened her resolve. Her court project, as the newspapers called it, was a network of schools in impoverished neighborhoods, using royal funds and arguing fiercely with advisors who thought the money better spent on military displays. She'd opened 7 schools so far, staffed by teachers who believed every child deserved education regardless of birth. Alexander's reforms were passing, but slowly. Inheritance laws had been modernized, corruption penalties increased, representation cautiously expanded to include more merchant-class voices. But every victory came with a cost. Every step forward met resistance from families who profited from the old ways. That evening, in their private chambers, Isabella attempted to teach Alexander bread braiding for the 10th time. He was still terrible at it, his aristocratic hands clumsy with the practical skill. "You're overthinking it," she said, laughing as his braid fell apart again. "I'm a king, in training. Overthinking is what I do." But he was smiling, relaxed in a way he never was in public. Isabella's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, still flat, but not for much longer. They hadn't announced the pregnancy yet, knowing it would intensify both support and opposition. The heir question would overshadow everything else. "Some days," she admitted quietly, "I wonder if we made the right choice." Alexander's hands stilled on the dough. He looked at her, really looked, seeing the exhaustion she tried to hide, the weight of constant scrutiny, the toll of fighting battles neither of them had chosen. "Some days I know we did," he said softly, "because I wake up next to you." Isabella leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Even when I'm argumentative and difficult and refuse to behave like a proper princess?" "Especially then." Christmas Eve, 1886. Exactly 1 year after the night that changed everything, Isabella and Alexander walked the streets of Ashford in disguise. She'd insisted, wanting to return to where it all began, wanting to remember what mattered. They carried baskets of bread, good bread, made with flour that didn't need to be stretched or rationed, and distributed it to families who needed it most. On a corner near the old church, they encountered a young woman with a child bundled against the cold. She looked exhausted, desperate, her clothes threadbare. Isabella didn't hesitate. She handed over the entire basket. The woman's eyes widened. "Miss, I can't. This is too much." "Please," Isabella said. "It's Christmas Eve. No one should be hungry on Christmas Eve." The woman took the basket with shaking hands, then looked more closely at Isabella's face. Recognition dawned slowly. "You're the princess," she whispered. "You're her. They said you'd forgotten where you came from, that you'd become like all the rest of them." Isabella smiled, thinking of the palace she'd left behind, the formal dinner she'd skipped, the protocol she'd broken to be here. "I could never forget," she said simply. "This is where I learned what matters." The woman blessed them both, clutching the bread and her child, and disappeared into the snowy night. Alexander and Isabella walked home together through the falling snow, his hand warm in hers, the empty basket swinging between them. The fight wasn't over, it would never truly be over. There would always be resistance, always be people who thought birth mattered more than character. But they were in it together, building something new from the ashes of something old. "Do you know what I've learned?" Isabella asked as the palace came into view, its windows glowing golden against the dark. "Tell me. True nobility isn't something you're born with or trained into." She squeezed his hand. "It's something you choose, every single day." Alexander stopped walking and pulled her close, kissing her in the snow the way he had that first night in the bakery, spontaneous and sweet and real. "Then let's choose it," he said. "Every single day, together." They walked through the palace gates, hand in hand, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought. A baker's daughter and a questioning prince, building a kingdom one choice at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one day at a time. And in the village behind them, in cottages warmed by bread given freely, families celebrated Christmas knowing that somewhere in that great palace, two people remembered what it meant to be human. That was nobility enough. From a last crust of bread to a crown, Isabella and Alexander's love story proves that the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness. Now I want to hear from you, my wonderful listeners. Comment bread if you would have given away your last meal like Isabella did. Comment crown if you think Alexander made the right choice fighting for both his throne and his love. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Lyra's Romance Stories for more historical romances that will make your heart race and your spirit soar. Tomorrow, I have another tale for you, a story of forbidden love, family secrets, and second chances. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember what Isabella and Alexander taught us. Real love doesn't demand you become someone else. It gives you the courage to become more fully yourself. Good night, dreamers. See you in the next story.